All right, get ready to dive deep because today we're tackling Johann Gottfried von Herder.
A true philosophical powerhouse.
Definitely a heavyweight, and we're talking 18th century here, so buckle up. Now, he might not be a household name like, say, Kant or Hume, but
He was a major force. You can even call him a polymath. His ideas left their mark everywhere, from language to history, politics, you name it.
we're going deep with this one, using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Herder as our guide. And get this, he practically invented entire fields of study that we take for granted today. Talk about influence.
It's true, he was a pioneer in the philosophy of language, linguistics, hermeneutics, anthropology, and biblical scholarship. It's hard to overstate his reach.
Okay, so we're not talking about some armchair philosopher
Yeah.
here. This is a guy who really shook things up. But before we get into all that, let's talk style. I mean, 18th century German philosopher, I'm already picturing like super dense, jargon-filled volumes.
You might be surprised. Herder's actually quite approachable. He deliberately avoided technical jargon and wrote in a very lively, engaging style.
So no struggling through page after page of obscure terminology.
Think of it as philosophy with personality.
Okay, that's definitely not what I was expecting. Was he trying to make philosophy more accessible to a wider audience? Is that what was going on?
Absolutely. He believed that philosophy should be relevant and useful for everyone, not just academics tucked away in their ivory towers.
I like that. So how did he make it accessible? What did he do differently?
Well, he had this very specific reason for writing in a more emotional and you might even say grammatically unconventional style.
Unconventional. That's interesting. Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
He believed that thought and feeling are inseparable, really deeply intertwined. And he felt the rigid structure of academic writing, the very formal style, that it actually suppresses this natural connection.
So he was breaking the mold, both in content and style. I mean, that's pretty rebellious for a philosopher of his time, wouldn't you say?
He was definitely pushing boundaries.
The entry also mentions that he was really wary of big, overarching philosophical systems, those grand theories that try to explain everything. Why was that?
He believed that striving for such systems, these perfect explanations, it could actually do more harm than good.
Harm. Okay, explain that one.
It leads to oversimplification, to a distortion of reality. Herder was all about careful observation, about open-mindedness, about being willing to revise your views when new evidence comes to light.
He sounds like a true empiricist, grounding his ideas in experience and observation rather than just abstract reasoning.
Exactly.
That's an approach I think a lot of us can appreciate. Now, no philosopher exists in a vacuum. Everyone is influenced by the ideas that came before them. Right. So who were some of the figures who shaped Herder's thinking?
Well, one of the most important but often misunderstood influences was Immanuel Kant.
Kant. Now, that's a name everyone recognizes. So was Herder just echoing Kant's ideas?
Not exactly. There's a twist here. It was the pre-critical Kant, before his most famous works, who really left his mark on Herder.
Pre-critical Kant. Okay, now you've got to explain that.
We're talking Kant in the 1760s. At that point, he was more skeptical of metaphysics, he favored empiricism, and even embraced a kind of sentimentalism in ethics.
Interesting. That's not the Kant we usually think of, the Kant of the critique of pure reason.
It's a side of Kant that often gets overlooked, but it was incredibly influential for Herder.
So to really understand Herder, we need to understand this less explored period in Kant's development. Now let's talk about one of the areas where Herder really made his mark, the philosophy of language.
He revolutionized the way we think about language and its relationship to thought.
I've heard a little about this. Wasn't he one of the first to argue that language isn't just a tool for expressing thought, but that it actually shapes thought itself?
Precisely. And it all starts with his 3 core theses about language.
3 theses. Okay, lay them on me.
First, all thought depends on and is bounded by language.
So no thought without language.
Right. The structure of our language actually shapes how we think. It sets the boundaries for what we can think about.
That's a huge idea. It means language isn't just this neutral tool. It's actively shaping our understanding of the world. What's the second thesis?
Herder argued that meaning is equivalent to word usage. The meaning of a word isn't some abstract thing out there. It's determined by how it's actually used in a specific context.
So context is key. Words can have all sorts of different shades of meaning depending on how and where they're used.
Exactly.
All right, that makes sense. So what about that third thesis? What's the final piece of the puzzle here?
His third thesis connects language to our physical experience of the world. Herder argues that our concepts, even our most abstract ideas, are ultimately rooted in our sensations.
Wow, so he's tying language, thought, and our physical experience all together.
Exactly. He believed that abstract thought isn't separate from our bodily experience, it's built upon it.
That's a really interesting connection. It challenges the traditional view that sees the mind as somehow separate from the body.
It does, and it has huge implications for how we understand and interpret things. This is where his hermeneutics comes in.
Hermeneutics, that's the art of interpretation, right?
Exactly. And Herder's philosophy of language directly informs his hermeneutics. He argues that to really understand someone else, to grasp their meaning, we need to take into account their language, their historical context, even try to imagine their sensations.
So it's about more than just understanding the literal meaning of their words. It's about trying to step into their shoes, to see the world from their perspective.
Exactly. It's about resisting the easy route of just projecting our own understanding onto their words. We have to make the effort to really meet them where they are.
It sounds like he's calling for a kind of radical empathy in the way we approach interpretation.
He is. It's about trying to understand how they experienced the world, what their words meant to them, not just to us. And this connects to another key aspect of Herder's hermeneutics, his emphasis on holism.
Right, the idea that we need to interpret texts as wholes, understanding the parts in relation to the whole and vice versa. It's like trying to understand a brushstroke in a painting without looking at the entire artwork.
Precisely. And this holistic approach, combined with his emphasis on empathy, really sets the stage for a whole new way of understanding and interpreting texts, cultures, historical periods, you name it.
It sounds incredibly powerful. Now, didn't Herder have a specific term for this empathic, holistic approach to interpretation? Something like Einfühlung?
Yes, but it's often mistranslated as simply empathy. For Herder, Einfühlung is a much more rigorous process. It involves meticulous research, it involves understanding the historical and cultural context, and it even involves trying to recreate the author's sensations imaginatively.
So it's not just about feeling what they felt, it's about understanding how their entire world, their whole way of experiencing things shaped their meaning.
Exactly. But it doesn't stop there. Herder takes it a step further by bringing psychology into the mix.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. How does psychology fit into his approach to interpretation? I'm on the edge of my seat.
He argued that truly understanding a text requires understanding the author's psychology, their intentions, their beliefs, their values.
Okay, so he's saying that to really grasp a text, we need to get inside the author's head to understand what was motivating them, what they were trying to achieve.
Precisely. And this applies even to seemingly non-linguistic art forms like sculpture or music. For Herder, even those art forms are expressions of concepts and beliefs.
That's fascinating. So even a sculpture or musical composition is, in a way, a form of communication. It's expressing the artist's inner world.
Exactly. It's about going beyond the surface and trying to understand the mind behind the creation. And to do this, Herder actually developed a method he called divination.
Divination. Wait, are we talking crystal balls and tarot cards here?
Not quite. Herder's divination is actually a process of hypothesis and potential falsification based on careful observation and critical thinking.
So it's more like detective work than fortune-telling.
Exactly. We look at the evidence, we form hypotheses about the author's psychology, and then we test those hypotheses against the evidence.
So it's about being a detective of the mind, trying to piece together the author's inner world based on the clues they've left behind in their work.
Precisely. And this approach, combined with his focus on language, context, and psychology, really revolutionized the way we think about interpretation.
This is blowing my mind.
Oh.
It's like he anticipated so many ideas that are central to modern literary theory and criticism.
He was definitely ahead of his time. And his insights don't stop there. His theory of translation is equally groundbreaking, and it flows directly from his ideas about language.
Okay, let's talk translation. I have a feeling Herder's going to challenge some common assumptions here.
You're right. Herder recognized that languages aren't just different codes for expressing the same thoughts. They actually represent different ways of seeing the world, different systems of meaning.
So a word in one language doesn't necessarily have a perfect equivalent in another language.
Right. And this makes translation much more challenging than simply finding the right words. It's about bridging those deeper differences in worldview and understanding.
So a good translation isn't just about accuracy. It's about capturing the spirit of the original text.
Exactly. And Herder even went so far as to reject the idea that a translation should aim to produce the text that the author would have written in the target language.
He rejected that idea. Why?
For Herder, this was often impossible because of the deep connection between thought and language. Each language has its own unique way of shaping thought.
So he's saying that each language has its own unique spirit, its own way of making sense of the world.
Precisely. And he even had a unique technique for dealing with those conceptual discrepancies between languages, what he called bending.
Bending, that sounds intriguing. What do you mean by that?
He recognized that sometimes there simply isn't an equivalent word or concept in the target language.
So what do you do in those situations?
Instead of forcing a word into an unnatural meaning, he advocated for bending the closest corresponding word in the target language to better reflect the original meaning.
So it's about finding a creative workaround to bridge those linguistic and conceptual gaps, but without sacrificing accuracy.
Right. It's about finding a balance between faithfulness to the original text and readability in the target language.
That's a really nuanced approach to translation. It sounds like Herder was laying the groundwork for how we think about translation even today.
Absolutely. His ideas about the connection between language and thought, the importance of cultural context, and his emphasis on accuracy were hugely influential.
So we've seen how Herder's ideas on language interpretation and translation were revolutionary, but his influence went even further, right? Didn't he play a key role in the birth of linguistics and anthropology as distinct disciplines?
He did. His focus on language, his recognition of the profound mental differences across cultures, these were essential insights for the emergence of these fields. He really paved the way.
So he was a bridge between the philosophy of his time and the development of these new scientific disciplines. It's amazing to think of the ripple effects of his ideas.
He was a true pioneer, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of his thought.
I can't wait to dive deeper.
You're absolutely right, a true pioneer. And to think we've only just scratched the surface, so much more to explore.
Well, let's keep digging then. We were talking about how Herder's ideas about language and interpretation were so revolutionary.
Yeah.
But his influence extends way beyond that, right?
Uh,
He also had some pretty radical views on how the mind itself works, like really groundbreaking stuff.
he did. Herder was a staunch naturalist through and through, and a firm anti-dualist. He just completely rejected that traditional separation of mind and body that had dominated Western philosophy for, what, centuries, really?
So he was challenging those big names, like, oh, who was it? Descartes, right? The one who famously said, I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. Descartes was all about that separation. Mind over here, body over there, two totally distinct substances.
And Herder was saying, no way.
No way. For Herder, there's no mind without a body. He saw both mental and physical phenomena as ultimately, well, manifestations of forces operating within the body, that is.
Forces, can you unpack that a little? It sounds like he was anticipating some of the ideas of modern neuroscience almost.
He was, in many ways. Herder saw the mind and body as these dynamic systems governed by forces. Now, of course, he didn't have the tools of modern science to really define those forces precisely.
Right, no brain imaging back then.
Exactly. But he saw them as the underlying cause of both our mental and physical experiences.
So instead of seeing the mind as this, I don't know, ethereal, immaterial thing, he was grounding it firmly in the physical workings of the body. It's a very embodied view of the mind, wouldn't you say?
Very much so. He was particularly interested in the phenomenon of irritation, a physiological process that scientists at the time had just started to identify.
Irritation, like as in a skin rash or something.
Well, it could be that, but more broadly, any kind of response to a stimulus, a physical reaction, essentially.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this. So how does irritation connect to the mind?
Herder saw it as a clue, almost, as to how a physical stimulus, something happening in the body, could actually give rise to a mental phenomenon.
Oh, that's fascinating. So for Herder, the mind wasn't some separate entity floating above the body, detached and aloof. It was right there in the thick of things, deeply embedded in the body's processes. I like that. It's a much more grounded and, I don't know, relatable view of the mind, I think.
It is, but it's not just about the mind being embodied. He also really emphasized the unity of the mind itself. He rejected this idea that was popular at the time, the mind being divided into separate faculties.
Right, like reason, emotion, imagination, all operating in their own little compartments.
Exactly. Herder wasn't having any of that. He didn't believe we could just neatly separate thought from feeling or sensation from volition, the will. He saw the mind as working as a unified whole, with all its faculties operating in concert.
That's a much more holistic view of the mind. and one that resonates with a lot of contemporary research in psychology and cognitive science, actually.
Hmm.
It's like he was way ahead of the curve on this.
He was. He even believed that this unity of the mind was something we should strive for, to cultivate. He thought that trying to isolate one faculty from the others, like trying to elevate reason above emotion, for instance, that this could lead to all sorts of problems, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
That makes a lot of sense. A healthy mind is an integrated mind, right? Where our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions are all working together in harmony.
Precisely. And that has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and how we cultivate our own mental and emotional well-being. It's a really important insight.
Speaking of interconnectedness, didn't Herder also have some pretty radical ideas about the social dimension of thought? Like challenging that whole notion of the individual self as completely independent and self-contained? I mean, it sounds like he was really pushing the boundaries of how we think about ourselves and our relationship to others.
You're right on the money. He was questioning those very foundations. For Herder, language, meaning, even thought itself, these are all fundamentally social phenomena.
Social. You mean they arise from our interactions with others?
Exactly. They emerge from our engagement with the world around us, from the shared language and cultural heritage that we inherit. It's not something we create in isolation.
So you're saying our thoughts aren't entirely our own. They're shaped by the social context we inhabit, the language we speak, the culture we're a part of.
That's it. He even extends this idea to the self. The self, for Herder, isn't some isolated, independent entity. It's formed, it's shaped by our relationships with others, our shared language, our cultural background. We are who we are because of our connections.
That's a profound idea and a little unsettling, honestly. It challenges some pretty deep-seated assumptions about individuality and autonomy, wouldn't you say?
It does. It raises big questions about the nature of identity, the role of culture, and the ethical implications of our interconnectedness.
And what about originality? If our minds are so deeply shaped by our social context, is there any room for genuine individual uniqueness?
You've hit upon a key tension in Herder's thought. But for him, it wasn't a contradiction. He saw the mind as a product of both our shared social context, that common ground, and our unique experiences and perspectives.
So we're shaped by our culture, but we also have the capacity to shape it in turn. We're not just passive recipients of social influence.
Absolutely. While we all inherit this common language and cultural heritage, we each bring our own unique set of experiences, interpretations, responses to that culture. We make it our own, in a way.
So the delicate dance, this interplay between the universal and the particular, between the shared and the unique. It's fascinating how Herder manages to hold these seemingly opposite ideas in tension. He doesn't shy away from the complexity.
He doesn't. He embraces it. Now, before we move on from his philosophy of mind, there's one more really fascinating and, for his time, quite radical idea I want to touch on. He rejected this notion of self-transparency.
Self-transparency. You mean the idea that we have direct and complete access to our own thoughts and feelings? Like we know ourselves perfectly.
Exactly. Herder recognized that, well, much of what goes on in our minds is actually unconscious. We're not always aware of the motives behind our actions, the beliefs shaping our perceptions, the emotions driving our behavior.
It sounds almost Freudian, doesn't it? This idea of the unconscious mind. But Herder was exploring these ideas decades before Freud. It's like he was tapping into something really profound about the human psyche.
He was, and this is where it gets even more interesting. Herder believed that literature could be a powerful tool for gaining insight into those unconscious depths.
Literature. Really. He saw novels, poems, plays as a way of understanding the hidden workings of our minds.
He did. He saw in great works of literature a kind of psychological depth and complexity that could reveal truths about human nature, truths that we might not otherwise recognize.
That's a powerful testament to the value of literature. It's not just about entertainment or escapism. It's about exploring the complexities of human experience, both individually and collectively.
Exactly. And it brings us to another key dimension of Herder's thought: his aesthetics. His engagement with literature and the arts wasn't just about psychological insights, though. He also developed a rich and influential aesthetic theory, one that challenged many traditional assumptions about beauty, art, and the role of the artist.
Okay, let's dive into that. I'm curious to hear what he had to say about art and beauty.
It is fascinating, and it's definitely a dimension of his work that's often overlooked. And it's important to remember the context here. We're talking 18th century Germany, where philosophy and religion, they were deeply intertwined. I mean, this was a time when many thinkers, even someone like Kant, were really wrestling with how to reconcile the insights of the Enlightenment with traditional Christian beliefs.
So it was a time of huge intellectual and spiritual upheaval, a real clash between, reason and faith. How did Herder navigate that? Was he trying to, defend traditional dogma in the face of all this rising skepticism?
Not exactly. While Herder was a devout Christian, he wasn't afraid to engage with the challenges posed by reason and science. He believed that faith, true faith, should be grounded in reason and experience, that religion should be compatible with the insights of modern thought.
So he wasn't one of those close your eyes and just believe kind of guys.
Not at all. He was all about finding a more sophisticated understanding of faith, one that could stand up to the scrutiny of reason, one that was intellectually honest.
I like that. So how did he go about doing that? What were some of his key ideas in the philosophy of religion?
Well, one of his most significant contributions, and it was definitely controversial at the time, was his insistence on strict secularism when it came to interpreting the Bible.
Secularism, you mean like treating the Bible just like any other historical text, no special treatment just because it's considered sacred?
Precisely. He argued that the Bible, even though it's a sacred text for Christians, was still written by human beings. Human beings living in particularly historical and cultural contexts. And to really understand it, we need to approach it with the same critical tools and methods that we use for any other historical document.
That must have ruffled some feathers back then. I
Mhm.
mean, it really challenges that traditional view of the Bible as like the literal word of God.
Oh, absolutely. It led him to some conclusions that many found quite unsettling. For example, he argued that the Bible contains contradictions and historical inaccuracies, and that different books of the Bible actually reflect the evolving beliefs and values of the people who wrote them, across different time periods.
So he wasn't afraid to acknowledge the human element in the Bible's composition, to see it as a product of its time, not just some timeless divine revelation.
Exactly. And this really paved the way for modern biblical scholarship.
It's a reminder that even our most sacred texts can be subject to critical scrutiny, that our understanding of them can evolve as our knowledge and perspectives change. Now, I also remember reading that Herder was critical of allegorical interpretations of the Bible. What did he mean by that, and why did he object to it?
Well, allegorical interpretation, you probably know, is a way of reading texts that looks for these hidden meanings and symbolic messages, beyond the literal level of the
Right,
words.
like trying to find some deeper secret meaning beneath the surface.
Exactly. And Herder argued that while some biblical passages might be intended as allegory, we should be cautious about reading the entire Bible as one big symbolic code.
So he was advocating for a more literal reading, focusing on what the authors were actually trying to say in their historical context.
In a sense, yes.
Yeah.
He believed that this excessive allegorical interpretation, it often distorted the original meaning of the text, and that it could be used to justify all sorts of claims that, well, frankly, weren't supported by a close reading of the text itself.
It sounds like he was trying to move away from interpretations that relied too heavily on speculation and symbolism, and to really ground our understanding of the Bible in a more historically and textually sound approach.
That's exactly right. He believed that by focusing on the plain meaning of the text and its historical context, we could arrive at a much deeper and more authentic understanding of the Bible's message.
And that approach has had a massive impact on biblical scholarship, even to this day. But despite his emphasis on reason, on a critical approach to Scripture, it's important to remember that Herder wasn't anti-religion. In fact, he saw it as a really powerful force in human life, didn't he?
You're absolutely right. He saw religion at its best as something that could inspire us to live more ethical lives, to connect to something larger than ourselves, and to provide a sense of meaning and purpose in a world that can often feel, well, chaotic and meaningless.
So for Herder, religion wasn't about blind faith or rigid dogma. It was about connecting with our deepest human values and aspirations. It was about making sense of our place in the world and finding a way to live a life that was, truly meaningful.
Beautifully said. He believed that a genuine and authentic understanding of religion should be based on reason, on experience, and on a deep respect for the diversity of human beliefs and practices.
It's a vision of religion that's both intellectually rigorous and deeply humane, I think. It challenges us to think critically about our own beliefs and to approach those who hold different faiths with understanding and respect.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that this search for meaning and purpose, it's a universal human quest, one that can take many different forms, but ultimately speaks to our shared longing for connection, for transcendence, for a sense of belonging in the world.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Johann Gottfried von Herder. We've traveled through his ideas on language, culture, history, the mind, even religion. And I think it's safe to say that he was a true visionary, a thinker ahead of his time. His insights continue to resonate with us today, challenging us to think deeply about ourselves, the world we live in, and the possibilities for creating a more just and humane future. Herder was a champion of human dignity, of cultural diversity, and of the power of reason and empathy to bridge the divides that so often separate us. His work reminds us that the pursuit of understanding, the search for meaning, the yearning for a more just and humane world, it's an ongoing journey, a task that requires us to constantly reflect, to question our assumptions, and to engage with different perspectives, even those that challenge our own. And that really is the heart of what the deep dive is all about. We explore these rich and challenging ideas, we wrestle with different perspectives, and hopefully we come away with a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring. Delve into the works of Herder and other great thinkers, and keep asking those big questions that drive our intellectual and spiritual journeys. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Johann Gottfried von Herder. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those aha moments that make life so rich and rewarding.